I've been a fan of The Walking Dead since I was an actual child. This series means a lot to me, and I can remember watching the episodes on TV as they aired when I was about 10 or so. So it was no surprise that I picked up the comic soon after I finished the actual show. I just want to say, while the show does mean a lot to me, I'm of the opinion that the comics are much better than the show, especially in the later seasons. I thought it would be fun comparing the biggest differences from the comic and the show, since there are a bunch, and because I love both mediums so much. Without any more talking, let's get into some of these differences. The story starts out pretty much the same verbatim. Rick gets in a gunfight and ends up going into a coma after being shot, where he then wakes up and the apocalypse has already begun. Of course, the show has more time to flesh some things out with Rick and Shane's relationship, a welcome change considering all of this literally happens on a singular page in the comic. The rest of the first episode in season 1 is pretty much entirely faithful to the comic. Rick stumbles out of the hospital and comes across a zombie missing his legs. He then decides to run to his house only to find nothing. His wife Lori and son Carl are nowhere to be found. He suddenly gets knocked out by a random kid with a shovel who calls for his dad. It's now that we meet Morgan, and this plays out the same in both versions, where they decide to go to Rick's police station to pick up some guns and a car. Eventually, after looting the police station, Morgan and Rick go their separate ways, with Rick heading to Atlanta in search of his family and Morgan going back to their house. Rick even ends up finding a horse to carry him the rest of the way after his car runs out of gas. It's now where we get a few of the differences between the two versions. First off, in the show, Lori and Carl are revealed to be alive when it shows Shane, Lori, and Carl in a survival camp outside of Atlanta, while in the comic, we don't actually see this until Rick comes back to the camp with Glenn. When Rick gets in the city, he's eventually knocked off his horse by a huge horde of walkers that are just chilling in the street. In the show, Rick is forced to run into a tank when he's contacted by Glenn through a radio inside. In the comic, Rick literally just runs into Glenn in an alleyway, and that's when Glenn and Rick escape the city by jumping across rooftops. They eventually make it back to the camp, and that's when Rick sees Lori for the first time. In the show, after Rick gets out of the tank, Glenn helps him make it to a different building where there are more people from the camp. We meet T-Dog, Morales, Jackie, and Merle, and none of these people are in the comics. We also meet Andrea, who is in the comic. The show sees Rick and his new friends escape the city by covering up in walker guts, with the exception for Merle, who is still on the roof after being handcuffed by Rick after he pulled a gun on the group earlier. Rick sees Lori and Carl for the first time, and Shane is equally shocked in both versions. Shane's character is a little different in each version. For example, Shane has had an affair with Lori, and that impacts how he feels when he sees Rick is alive. In the show, Shane is shown to be shocked, but still happy his best friend is alive. He's a little hurt because, he loves Lori kind of like his own wife, but nonetheless, he's genuinely glad that Rick is okay. In the comic, it's immediately apparent that Shane does not give a fuck. In fact, he's pissed that Rick is back because that means he can't be with Lori anymore. After Rick makes it back to the camp, we're introduced to a few more people. In both versions, we meet Dale, Andrea, and her sister Amy. We meet Jim, Carol, and her daughter Sophia, as well as Lori, Carl, and Shane, of course. In the show, there are a few more people that aren't in the comic. Like I said, T-Dog, Jackie, Morales, and Merle. There's a few more background characters like Carol's abusive husband, Ed, but the biggest difference, of course, is the hugely famous Daryl Dixon. Daryl is not in the comic at all, and he's a complete show invention, and it comes to a shock to a lot of people that don't know that. The comic has a few other people that the show doesn't adapt, like a guy named Alan and his wife Donna, and their two sons Billy and Ben, but they're largely unimportant for right now. There are a few more differences between the people that are in the comic and the show. For example, Carol in the show is an older lady, while in the comic she's a much younger blonde. But other than that, we're pretty much the same for right now. I say for right now, because later on, a lot of the characters shift away from their comic book counterparts, but we're not there yet. In the show, Rick decides to head back to Atlanta to save Merle after leaving him on that route. He takes T-Dog, Daryl, and Glenn to help him with this. In the comic, Rick's return to Atlanta is simply because he decides to do a supply run with Glenn, and then it's now where Rick figures out he can cover himself with walker guts to become invisible. They use this trick to bring back some guns for the camp. In the show, it's discovered that Merle cut his own hand off and escaped the roof by himself. While searching for the group, they get jumped by the Vatos gang, and Glenn gets kidnapped. Eventually, the two groups come to a compromise and they both leave happy. This whole plot is entirely made up by the show, and it never even happens in the comics. Eventually, in both versions, the camp gets bombarded by a horde of walkers, and it sees the death of Amy. Jim also gets bit, and he dies pretty much the same way in both versions, with the group letting him die in peace while also leaving him a gun. Without a doubt, the biggest change in the entire season is what happens next. Eventually, Rick and Shane get in an argument over how things should be run and what they should do next, and Shane literally pulls a gun on Rick and tells him he should have never come back. It's then that Carl shoots Shane out of nowhere and to protect his dad, and Shane dies right then and there at the camp. It's at that point that Rick decides that leaving the city is their best course of action. While on the show, Rick and Shane don't have this argument until much later in season 2, and Rick simply decides to leave because he wants to try and contact the CDC based off of what Morgan told him. While on the road, Comic Rick and his group stumble across a man with his daughter and her boyfriend. This man introduces himself as Tyrese. This is pretty different from the show, considering Tyrese has to show up for another 2 seasons. Rick invites the 3 of them to join the group, and Tyrese accepts. Eventually, while on the road, Rick finds a gated neighborhood called Wilkshire Estates and decides that it would be smart to try and rest there for a few days and search the place for supplies. Eventually, this plan falls flat when it's discovered the place is infested with walkers, and it leads to the death of Donna, Alan's wife, and they end up just leaving and going back on the road. And while on the road, Lori figures out she's pregnant, and she actually tells Rick immediately, something that doesn't even happen until season 2 of the show. In the show, this whole plot is replaced by Rick's plan to make it to the CDC, where the group meets Jenner, a scientist working for the CDC. Jenner tells Rick there is no hope for the world, and he's the last person even reporting still. Eventually, Jenner traps Rick and his group in the facility while the self-destruct protocol is activated. Eventually, Rick convinces Jenner to let them go, which he does, but for some reason, Jackie decides to stay with Jenner. And to be fair, who really gave a fuck about Jackie? She was kind of the most forgettable character. Anyway, I'm getting sidetracked. But before Rick leaves, it's now that Jenner actually tells Rick that walkers come back no matter how they die. And unlike in the comic, Rick doesn't find out about this long into the prison arc, but to be fair, it's not revealed what Jenner said until season 2, so. Rick and the rest escape the facility and head back on the road, same as the comic, just minus the explosion. And that's the end of season 1. I highlighted the major differences between the two. Of course, there's a lot more smaller things that I didn't list, but I listed the ones I thought were the most interesting. The show differs from the comic even more in the second season, but I'll save that for another day. But anyway, thank you for watching, and let me know if you want to see more. Like I said, I'm a fan of both mediums, and I enjoyed making the video, so thank you so much, and see you in the next one.